Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. Thanks for joining me on another pilot episode. I'm a partner at Cimpatico Studios. Cimpatico Studios is a San Francisco based tech media startup producing live stream talk shows about complex business and social challenges and highlighting professionals around the world who are working on these issues. Our shows are live streamed into Cimpatico, a new type of collaboration platform to help communities of professionals share knowledge and coordinate efforts to improve outcomes of common interest. We're launching the Climate Adaptation channel, yay, adaptation, where I will be hosting regular live stream interviews just like this one. This show is called Initiating Coverage, and on the show, we are joined by global experts to chat about topics and problems that Simpatico intends to cover extensively in the coming months and years. To kick off our coverage of urban forests, I am joined by Michael Yadrick to explore how urban forests may help us adapt to climate change and how we may help urban forests adapt to climate change itself. Michael Yadrick is the host of the Tree Hugger podcast. Yay, another podcaster. A show focused on ecological restoration, highlighting the humans involved with the science and practice. He's also a plant ecologist with Seattle Parks and Recreation. Supporting the Green Seattle Partnership, he designs and directs the work on restoration projects across Seattle's forested parklands. Michael, thank you so much for being a guest on today.
Thanks for having me. It's great. Good to see you.
Okay, so you are in a super cool city, Seattle, but I have to acknowledge the situation. How you doing over there right now with you guys were sort of a hotbed of the coronavirus?
We're kind of ground zero for it in the States, I guess. I am loosely kind of back vacillate between watching the news, reading the news, and then kind of retreating. But I'm working from, I've been, like many of you, I think, working from home remotely. So I'm super cozy with my wife and son and family dog right now. And it's good and bad, obviously. Like I cut the commute down in by dramatically, and
Right.
then but yeah, I'm running a ton and getting out in my local parks. So there's some good aspects to it, I think.
Okay, before we jump into urban forestry, and there's obviously a ton of things to cover around this issue. We're going to talk adaptation and climate change, but a little bit about yourself. I mean, how long you've been working there in your present position, and yeah, how did you kind of come about into the urban forestry space?
Ooh, good story. Yeah, so I've been at the city of Seattle for over 9 years now. So I'm one of a small team of plant ecologists that works on urban forestry issues in the forested natural areas. So we consider the whole city has urban forests, across the matrix, but we work over 2,700 acres of forested parkland, which is about 5% of the city. And so really it's the bigger parks. So the largest park is up to 500 acres, but then we work in like really obscure small areas as well, that are just too steep or too wet for other people to work in. But really, I've always pretty much all my whole career been involved in restoration to a certain extent. After college, I went and I did a stint as an AmeriCorps volunteer. I worked on riparian restoration for a few years, and then I jumped. I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Bolivia,
Nice.
and so I spent a couple years, in South America doing working in a nursery and doing forestry extension work, and then worked for a few land trusts doing restoration or conservation. And then I landed in Seattle. So that's been my history. But really, except for that stint in like Latin America, really I've always been working in urban spaces.
Okay, so you wouldn't even ask this question with someone doing their job on the East Coast, but you're in Seattle. Do you know if any of your urban forest is any left that's old growth forest?
In Seattle, yeah. So urban, old growth forests, essentially, the way I characterize urban forests is their age, but also the characteristics of their structure, right? So in the Pacific Northwest, for what that means to me is trees of a exceptional size or age, but also there's certain also structural things that are going on with like standing deadwood or deadwood on the ground, are pretty important. And then like a mixture of like diversity of species, like multiple layers of canopy, middle layer, and then understory. So in the city of Seattle, we were actually featured in a book a few years back called Urban Old Growth Forests. And there are a couple forests that are pretty old and big. One is Seward Park in the southeast part of town, and then Schmitz Park Preserve, which is in West Seattle. And they're not like untouched, but Like back in the day during the Depression, I think they opened up sewer park for like wood cutting so people could heat their homes. So there's a certain amount of like high grading, I guess, that occurred because they took out like middle layer forest. But yeah, there's big old trees, and yeah, they're pretty exceptional and like pretty marvelous to work in and walk through.
Don't have that luxury on the East Coast. All right, you're a podcaster. Let's talk a little bit about that before we jump into some of the Seattle urban forestry issues. But okay, you've got this tree hugger podcast. How long you been doing it, and what do you talk about on it? What's your model for the podcast?
Right. So I started the podcast. I started thinking about it. Well, I've been thinking about it for a few years. I mean, I'm a podcast fan, of course, of yours. And then I'd been listening to, trying to find plant related. I'm really a plant person, but I'm a people person too. So, but I'd really been trying to find something restoration related and when found it lacking really. So my first episode dropped in November and I've been chugging away ever since. Producing episodes every couple weeks because it's my side hustle, or not a hustle even, it's just it's a hobby. So really I focus on the science, practice, and humans of ecological restoration. I think the focus is really highlighting, for me, from my background, really focusing on how restoration can lead to really positive outcomes for human livelihoods and health, and then really a just transition in a warming world.
And with the podcast, I'm sure you, even though it's probably a Seattle focus, but you must have listeners that have kind of come from around the world, right? That's just kind of how it
I
happens.
I think so. Really, I don't pay for the all the big stats.
Oh, you
you know,
should. You should.
no, I'm wondering. I'm a little curious, but I don't know if it's really gonna paying for it is really gonna tell me or lead to anything that I do differently. So, yeah, I expect. I mean, my first episode was an interview with Jacob Mills. He was in Australia, so he's focused on microbiome rewilding. So he studies how our environmental exposure to nature can influence like gut health, and how that exposure to old friends. There's this old friends hypothesis that basically our interaction with nature can lead to enhanced public health and decrease in chronic illness. So I've had some other like international guests as well. So Tim Christopherson, who is the coordinator for the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. He was in, yeah, that interview. He was in Kenya, and so he's there leading the charge on the UN decade that's coming. That's named years 2021 through 2030 will be the decade on ecosystem restoration. So, but yeah, but like there's no. I love to do in-person interviews, so definitely I'm really focused around Cascadia as well. But I think there's some global issues that I really want to dig into.
Well, I gotta get follow up with that public health one. My wife does a podcast on gut health and such. So maybe there's some overlap there. All right. Okay. So related to this, so on public health, and let's give a little bit of context to urban forests, and I think it's actually really relevant with what's going on with coronavirus, how people are staying sane and on this. But what are the benefits of urban trees and forests to urban dwellers? I mean, I know that's a very generic question, but like,
Sure.
why do you, they hired you for a reason?
Yeah, right. So I think there's the myriad benefits I think most people are familiar with, but I think the one thing for me, like I've always worked in the urban space. So for me, in the upper left part of the United States, there's 4 million people that live in the Puget Sound area. So there's like essentially 4 counties that are stacked together, and most of the population of Washington State lives on the west side of the Cascade Mountains. So 4 million people, probably 200,000 live in my city. Actually, I'm in Tacoma, and then 4 billion plus people live in urban areas in the world. Like most of us live urban, and then by the year 2050, 2/3 of the population will live in urban areas. And really, nearby nature is pretty important, and the power of trees as ecosystem engineers. There's a lot of benefits, not only with biodiversity, but with, especially in urban heat islands. If we engineer or construct our cities without trees, they're only going to get warmer. So I think I read something recently that the quarantine in China from the pandemic recently could potentially have saved like 50 to 75,000 lives from premature deaths due to poor air quality. So trees clean the air. They direct shading, and the evapotranspiration from of moisture allows for cooling of the cities. In around the Puget Sound area, that interaction with the Puget Sound and with the oceans perhaps keeps the cities cool as well. But I think there's some evidence that there's the water, our waters, our oceans have been absorbing so much carbon for so many years, and that was still offsetting the land temperatures. But right now, I think they've absorbed so much carbon that, into the future, they may not have that mediating effect on the land temperatures now. So there's a lot of complex things going on, and I haven't figured them all out. But yeah, I think trees are lovely. Like, I like them for so many different reasons, and like I said, the environmental exposure for urban dwellers is like super important for our health.
Okay, let's talk about urban heat a little bit. With Seattle, you typically think of rainy and cold, even though it's a beautiful city. It's quite cool. Is the heat island effect and like extreme heat an issue that you're concerned about in Seattle, especially with some of the climate models and the projections?
I mean, we are, and you compare our projects, the exposure that some of our parks have compared to some other sites, restoration sites like 20 miles or 30 miles away up into the foothills of the Cascades, our temperatures can be very different. And especially during the summers, that extended droughts and nighttime highs as well can have significant effects on trees and the way that they move water and store carbon and then stay alive. So I think to a certain extent, yeah, we have sites that are right near Interstate 5. And so we have some thermal imagery from a couple years back, and I can't tell what the temperatures are, but you can see the where the hot spots are around the city, and it really validates what you feel on the ground. Really, it's like, and the coolest spots are the forested parklands. So the areas that have streams running through them, the areas closest to the water are cooler, and then you can see these just red spots light up, and they are around the synthetic turf fields, around industry, and the neighborhoods that really, what you say see that some of these neighborhoods that traditionally haven't seen the resources that other neighborhoods have seen. So places where trees have been cut down for whatever reason. So yeah, we definitely have some exposure in some areas, and I think to a certain extent we're seeing what's probably a long time coming, some the outcome of some maladaptation to that bioclimatic change. I think we're seeing some death, some vulnerability on some certain species like big leaf maple and western red cedar. And we're seeing like mature trees that were either never irrigated or long weaned off water start to fail.
Okay, I think in Seattle, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys have set a target of 40% tree cover. Does that sound right?
30%.
30%. Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
well, I'm challenging
30%.
40%.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know. No, I love to do 40%, but
So, and my follow up question to that is okay, what is it right now and why 30%? A lot of times when I hear these targets that these cities shoot for, part of it is just an aspirational, but you're an ecological restoration guy. Is it related to that? Is there sort of a ecological value to that number?
right. I think that number has been a target set by many municipalities, especially the ones around here. I think it was a number American Forest came up with maybe decades ago, related to stormwater benefits related to a 30% canopy. So a lot of cities are shooting for that, and we are Seattle is upwards of 30% actually, almost. So there's been several instances of some analysis on canopy cover, and the technology's changed, so it's really hard to compare the first analysis to this last one. But right now what we're showing for the newest lidar analysis is showing like upwards of like 28%. The city of Tacoma, where I live, where my family lives, is upwards of like a little over 20%, and they also have a 30% goal. And that's a lot of canopy to make up. I mean, that needs that requires a lot of tree planting. And for us, and then for Seattle to get to 40% is it's a lot of trees to plant and care for moving forward as well. So yeah, and I think there's probably some like 30% or 40% may not be appropriate for other cities around. I think you live like in Arizona, is that right? So
Tucson,
like
yeah.
yeah, Tucson. So it may not 30% may just be a pipe dream really. But yeah.
Well, I had a conversation with an urban planner here in Arizona, and in Phoenix, one of the things is that they are trying to establish more of an urban canopy for other purposes, like cooling and. But what's not being factored in, and we'll get into this about the impacts of climate change, is that they're putting non-native species, and it's using up more water, and so all of a sudden, like, oh well, we're cooling things, but then we're creating a different problem over here, and you got to be sensitive to I guess the local fauna
Of
and long-term
course.
issues. So
Yeah, and as a restorationist, I'm very much focused on native plants because they're adapt generally we think they're like adapted and appropriate for the area that you're working in. But there has been, I mean, a lot of our work is actually removing non-native invasive trees that have established and dispersed into the natural areas, and they can have some cascading effects on the diversity and the trajectory of the forest moving forward.
okay, let's talk a little bit about climate change and what that's going to mean for Seattle. How is that factoring to how you are identifying areas to conserve or restore? I mean, are you using vulnerability assessments? Really, what's your approach there in regards to the urban forest?
Yeah, we do. And for ecological restoration, what one of the principles is to draw knowledge from a variety of different places. So we use science, but then also like just local observations, and then traditional knowledge as well. So but really just the last couple years we did consult with a local entity called Resilient Forestry, and they did some analysis of our monitoring and inventory data that we had been collecting for a number of years, as well as have used the latest lidar images to give us a snapshot of where our forests are, and also looking at like landform, like exposure to the southern hemisphere is one thing. Like those are some of the sites that get blasted as much that is more than any that with sun. Um, and then those spots like close to the freeways are pretty rough too. They also looked at our canopy composition. So composition, we don't have like I think maybe from people that come from maybe fly into SeaTac Airport and fly into Seattle, it looks like just this carpet of green, and then even the city itself looks pretty green. However, there's some issues. Our composition, we don't have those big giant conifers like we had traditionally. Like a lot of them were cut down and not replanted 150, 170 years ago. So right now most of the composition of our forest is mostly made up of like one or two species, which can have some cascading effects. Like if, like I said, with big leaf maple, if a pest um, starts to impact like one species, it can, and that species is like really just a monoculture throughout the urban forest. That pest can just run through that species, and then we can really have some real issues with canopy cover, over time.
I lived in the Atlanta area for a while, and as you fly into there, you'd also see it. It looks like it's completely covered with trees, but part of the problem is that they would just, when it comes to like stormwater runoff, they would just pipe everything into the local creeks. So you're not getting the advantage of that urban forest to actually mitigate against that thermal pollution. So
Mhm.
is that a strategy there in Seattle when it comes to using that? Because your water resources obviously are so important
Of
there.
course, of course. Yeah. So I think one strategy as well is sort of this resistance strategy. And we've inherited projects from the utility, from the public utility. They did a lot of stream restoration and tree planting around the streams like decades ago. So we've inherited the maintenance of those projects. So, and they partially fund the work as well. And because salmon are so important to us, so working around our riparian areas is a pretty substantial focus every year. And so we focus in those forested ravines are generally cooler. So we have but sometimes, yeah, they have the issues with invasive weeds. I kind of jokingly say a lot of what we do is just kill weeds and plant trees, but yeah, a lot of what we do, but it's so important because the invasive weeds have that, they create those, like they're the stress and the threats on the forest. So if we can remove those somewhat passively, we can rely on the ecosystem to recover on its own. So yeah, the forest areas are fairly important. Also to orca recovery
Hmm.
in the Puget Sound as well. So there's some resident pods of orcas, and some of it is related their health. Some of the you can take it back to what happens on land. Uh, so it's important to keep the urban forest pretty safe, especially for storm. Yeah, because stormwater is like one of the, like basically the number one pollutant in the waters of the
Yeah.
U.S.
Thermal pollution. Okay, we have a community of adapters who are watching this right now, and I'm getting some questions in the chat room, and I want to ask a couple questions here. This one, it's going to put you on your toes, so let's see how.
Oh, geez.
Good luck with this one.
All right.
Dhaka, which is the capital of Bangladesh, is the sixth most populated city in the world. What should be their plan on urban forestry? And this doesn't have to be a detailed one, but maybe you could have some
Dhaka.
general some general
Wow.
recommendations if you have any
Yeah.
insight.
I'm gonna look this one up afterwards. I don't know. So in my I think so. The first and foremost, one principle around ecological restoration is stakeholder engagement. So I think, in absence of a plan, just putting a forum together and allowing people to voice their opinion on what they want, because you need to vet it. So, any plan that's created in isolation is bound to fail if it kind of comes from the top down. So I think I'm kind of a grassroots sort of guy, I guess. So I think inclusion of like women and elderly and youth and indigenous peoples in your plan is always pretty important, because they're the ones, they're the people on the front lines. So I think that's important to have. So just coming up with a plan that's very, because you can't just easily copy and paste like my plan from Seattle and put it in Bangladesh, given all the site specifics and what's going on in that town. So, yeah, but really, like I said, like if you have natural areas, I think like a focus on native restoration is pretty important. But then in the urban areas, there's lots of opportunities for using non-native species as well. And particularly too, because our native species sometimes won't be locally adapted anymore, and that's what we're seeing with these impacts and these failures of big old native trees. Is that and I think you had an episode a while back talking about this like this climatic niche for our local species is changing, so you may have to pull from closer to the like away um, towards the direction of climate change, I guess. So um, yeah, so those are some guidelines.
Okay, that's good. And the next question was related about getting community people to participate, and you addressed that. You talked about
Yeah,
getting recruiting, and so you kind of answered that. So yeah, yeah. So you need to look up DACA and see what the urban forestry
I
efforts are
will.
going right
I
now.
will.
A few more questions here. I want to talk about when I went to New York and kind of learned about urban forestry there, the issues of equity and the notion of tying access to urban forests to academic achievement and just pollution and all that. And I just wondering, just as the demographic makeup of different cities, how much of an issue is equity and economic justice an issue in Seattle? Because in New York, that was a complete strategy that they were implementing.
Hmm.
Is it an issue in Seattle? My impression of Seattle, maybe it's not as diverse as New York, and so
No. That's probably correct. Yeah, but there is, I mean, we're largely white population, I think, in Pacific Northwest or Washington, Oregon in general. Like, I think we're still probably like our neighborhoods or urban areas are probably 60 or 70% white, but it is changing, I think. Yeah, and like you said, and gentrification is an issue as well. So genuine displacement is a concern. Homelessness response is pretty huge as well, and
okay,
largely a lot disproportionately people of color and like veterans are the ones that are living on the streets really. So um, yeah, so we have some specific strategies, and they're like some smart goals associated with them, but it's really like we like to engage youth. We always have been. I think it's perfect for us because it's Seattle Parks and Recreation. Like we're parks and recreation, so we have this ties to recreation. So the programming for our volunteer activities is um, is different if we were situated in just like a natural resources sort of unit. So we always like in the summer times, kids are out of school, we work with kids and programs, and so there's that mentoring and leadership development that also occurs, and it's kind of like a green pipeline. So at some point in time, like I'm going to retire, I think at some point, hopefully, and someone's got to take my place. So it's pretty important, and really like my pathway is very specific to me, and there's all these different entry points and access to that people can take to eventually become the next urban forester. So that's pretty key, but also just working in other parts of town. So Seattle has this legacy, like Olmsted legacy, as some of the other development of other parks in other cities as well. So there are some parks that have been in the system for over 100 years, and so I think that kind of meet those parks. The look of those parks kind of meets your assumptions. Like they probably look good because they've had the most resources and time invested in them. And then there's some other places that have been acquired by the city over time, and they just look like any other like unkept like vacant lot, right? So, but they're supposed to be a natural area. They'll never have a ball field on them or a playground. They could be an urban ravine, and so yeah, we intentionally work in those areas as well, but also balancing maintenance on some of these other sites that have been in the system for a long time.
Okay, we're getting more questions from the chat room, and when we go into after this episode is over, we're going to go into this just chatting section. But I want to get a couple more questions here, and this is a good one from Fahim. In a city full of skyscrapers, there are very few open areas. How can an urban forestry be done efficiently? And I guess part of this is just retrofitting an area. How do you bring urban forestry into a highly developed area?
Right. Yeah, and I think so. I'd put a plug in for conservation to begin with. So I mean, I think some cities are still growing. I don't think some cities are totally built out, and there's a lot of like with Seattle, there's a lot of infill development happening. And actually, I think there's some of the tree canopy is at risk. So, but if cities are growing out, it's worthwhile to plan for them to plan for green infrastructure as well. So, I put a plug in for that. But to retrofit areas, yeah, there's some cool examples of de what you call like road removal or yeah, parking lots that are no longer needed for whatever reason. Just kind of yeah, like I said, we're assisting the recovery of an ecosystem. So if you remove that concrete, something's got to fill that space. So I think there can be a lot of emphasis on a kind of infill, we call it like infill development, but like an infill conservation strategy. So as some because gray infrastructure has a lifespan, right? So as it becomes obsolete or falls apart, um, and if you have that proper planning with a lot of other voices coming together, I think you can have some good conservation outcomes. But yeah, a lot of like your what you can grow in a space is dependent upon how much room you have, right? So if you have a narrow planting strip that's only 3 or 4 feet wide, that kind of dictates what species of tree you can put in there. But if you double that or triple that, then all of a sudden you can put like a redwood, in that space, or like a big conifer, which has much more habitat value or stormwater value associated with it or cooling value associated with it. So, but there's a lot of other things I don't even really know about. I kind of loosely track, which is like green buildings and like just I know just planter boxes like in on somebody's not I'm saying your backyard, but on your back porch or whatever can have pretty significant values for bird life. So I am focused on trees and plants a lot, but I think we should shouldn't discount the value of urban wildlife and its ability to provide ecosystem services, particularly pollination and then seed dispersal and things like that to allow natural systems to adapt and evolve on their own.
Okay, we can. There's a ton more urban or forestry issues we can
Yeah,
cover. I want to do one more question. The chat room has come alive, and I want you guys in the
nice.
chat room to save those questions till we get into the just chatting section because we want to kind of wrap this up. This the last question here from Abdur is: can urban forestry address and have any role to reduce the threats that we're like dealing with the coronavirus? And I would, I guess, maybe frame that question too is like, can it play a role? I guess in our response. And what do you think?
Yeah. So right now, I've been using that term essential services like every day, several times a day. And in our state, the governor's decree, vegetation management, kind of, we don't neatly fit in one of those categories. I think we want to tag ourselves as essential services, but parks are one of the only are the few things open for business right now, right? Restaurants are closed down except for takeout. Some people, unfortunately, like people are losing their jobs, people are losing their lives, but people have never been in quarantine before, they're freaking out, but I mean but there's we can still take walks. So I think it's really important to the well-being and mental health of urban dwellers to be able to access natural areas at this point in time. So forests are still open for business, trails are still open for business, playgrounds might be shut down, ball fields and other programming, but it's we can still get out. Like we don't need to stay inside because I think, but like I said, the environmental exposure is very important even at this point in time because we don't know how long this is going to be going on for.
Okay, so I want to wrap this up. We've just scratched the surface. I hope we can get you back on and dig into more of some of these issues and some of the specific examples of what you've been doing in Seattle. I want you to stick around. I'm going to get
Okay.
you into this just chatting section, but thanks again for coming on and thanks for what you're doing.
Appreciate it. Thanks for what you do.
All
Thanks for
right.
having me.
All right, just hold it. I'll be right back with you.
Okay.